Good to see enough people coming in because they want to get out of the rain. But we hope that all of you will stay and listen to what's we hope will be a good discussion about a very moving and interesting book written by Nusrat Jafri. It's called "This Land We Call Home," and I keep teasing her that I'm the guy who brought the copy because she left her copy back in the hotel. So I want to, Nusrat, just tell the audience a very little bit about your book, and then ask you a few questions. Okay, so I made some notes. Uh, Nusrat comes from a family. I don't know if she thinks it's interesting, but anybody who reads this book will certainly think it is a very interesting family. It's a story, actually. This book is a story of strands in her life, in her family's life, that deal with various Indian realities. I'm talking about caste and religion and interfaith marriages and conversions, prejudice, and all kinds of things that appear in this book to different degrees. And she tells a story, and that's the interesting thing about the book, in her family, and it parallels Indian history through the perhaps about the last century. And that's an interesting device that she uses that I want to ask you about a little bit later. But first, just a bit more about the book. So, to give you the background, Nusrat's great grandfather Hardayal belonged to what's called the Bhantu tribe in Rajasthan, which the British in 1871 formed something called the Criminal Tribe Act, which listed about 150 different tribes as criminal, explicitly criminal, and Bhantu was one of those. So, to escape that stigma, he and his wife converted to Christianity and moved away from Rajasthan. And then many years later, a granddaughter married a Muslim. As it happens, that Muslim man was a alumnus of BITS Pilani, which was my own alma mater. And these two were Nusrat's parents. And Nusrat now has a son called Dylan, who I wonder if he's named after a famous Nobel Prize winning singer. So anyway, I don't want to tell you more about the book because I want Nusrat to do that. But I want to just shoot some questions at you. And the first one I want to ask you, Nusrat, is when did you first learn about your great grandfather's criminal tribe past, and what did you make of it?
Um, Firstly, thank you for everyone who stayed back for the session. Um, I think I don't remember the exact. I don't remember the exact occasion or the event when the history of my ancestors was in a way known to me. It's been part of my childhood in a lot of happy stories that my mamu would tell us, or my mother, that my great grandfather belonged to a tribe which stood up against the oppression of caste into society as well as the British. So it came in bits of, I learned through a lot of cinema as well, because the only way cinema has projected Bhatus is projecting them as feared thieves. So in a lot of movies in the 60s and 70s, there would be these scenes where the entire village would start shutting down because Daku aa rahe hain, kind of things. And that's unfortunately the only representation of Bhatus in popular parlance. So, I mean, I was intrigued. I wanted to know more, and little bit stories that kept in about their outcast identity and how they made the shift to conversion. So I think conversion is what made me intrigued.
Um, so you mentioned that they were held up as this, kind of fighting against oppression of the caste. In fact, criminal tribes often talk about how they were the first war of independence was fought because they fought against the British or resisted the British. Let's say, I don't know if it was an organized war, but they resisted the British. So there is that also. That's part of the history. Yeah.
There's a lot of forgotten history of Bhatus and many other tribes that were criminalized by the British under the 1871 uh, acts and laws that followed. So, Bhatus were traditionally, they were street performers. A large chunk of them were also uh, nomadic herders, which is what Hardayal's family was. And when the British notified them, they were suddenly, all other parts of their history, by nature of them being nomadic, were erased. So they were actually very instrumental in passing messages between revolutionaries when through their songs sometimes, or they would just escape and leave a note with another freedom fighter. So, and just by nature of being defiant to the colonial rulers, they were the ones who were standing up.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the story of Bheels, it's even more apparent, and it's probably more documented. So yeah, they were. British was suspicious of them and of any other non-sedentary tribe after the 1857 revolt, and that was one of the main reasons that they went ahead with passing these laws like Habitual Offenders Act and
Criminal Tribes Act.
Criminal Tribes Act. And I think the need to do this was primarily suspicion, and they leveraged the already existing caste order in the society, which was anyway which was making life difficult for anyone that didn't come in the Hindu caste order. So yeah, they used it, and they made a series of extremely horrible laws which branded them, entire communities, made their lives difficult. They had to they had to go and report to the police station in every 10 days. They were put it in gated colonies, settlements, where there was a roll call twice or thrice a day. If they wanted to move out of the settlement, they had to carry an I card. And if there was, God forbid, a crime, the first person suspected was
Was-
a member of these tribes. Yeah.
So your great grandfather had to live with all this prejudice, and then what struck me somewhat sadly, there's an irony in the book that at least I felt that many years later, his daughters stopped speaking to their youngest sister, your grandmother, because your mother married a Muslim. So like I said, I was really struck and saddened by this irony. And did you and your mother see it similarly, or were you struck by it also? Was your mother struck by that? The same, I mean, not the same, but prejudice that he had to face, then your mother had to face in her own family because of the marriage to a Muslim man.
So when my mother converted to Islam, so in the book I've discussed in great detail what my mother's stature was within the family, within the seven sisters of Hardayal Singh. So apart from I think the eldest daughter Panna and the youngest Chunno, Prudence, my grandmother, none of the others married. And my daughter Meera was like their child, like all the Masis bringing.
Your mother, Meera.
Yeah, my mother Meera was like brought up as like a child in whom all the Masis had invested. They had great hopes from her, and she was a good student. And anyway, they were like angry with Prudence for marrying John because they didn't think he was suitable. And there are certain other things in the book which kind of attest the prophecy that they had. So when my mother married my father, there was a sense of personal loss and disappointment that they felt because they invested more, and also because there was a lot of help given by the other sisters, by my grand aunts to the family. So they felt they had a greater say in the family. There was a lot of discrimination against the Muslim community, especially because it was so close to the horrors of partition. And I think a lot of their idea of what a Muslim would be was driven from the aftermath of the partition. Yeah. So, I mean, Hardayal was happy with my father, but his daughters weren't.
Or not, yeah. So actually that leads into what I want to ask next, which I alluded to in the beginning. You tell your story and it's interspersed with the story of our country, the history of our country in these last, independence and a few years before independence. Did you set out with that idea when you started writing this memoir? Did you set out with this idea that you're going to be doing this parallel story? And do you see your family's history in some ways mirrored in our country's history? Did that what I'm trying to get at is that did that occur to you before writing the book, or is that something that came to you as you started writing the book?
I had set out with the idea of mirroring and writing a parallel history of India for sure, because I was very intrigued with the fact that my mother was born in 1947, and in many ways, independent India was born into a new identity in the same year. So I always, as a child, I used to find it fascinating that if it's India's 60th year of independence, it's my mother's 60th year as well. So there was a lot to follow in. There is also obvious inspiration from growing up reading Salman Rushdie and, being very enchanted with the idea of doing this. But while I started researching on Bhatus, on the criminal tribes, there was a lot to talk about in what was in Indian society at that time. And of course, in a little structure, like at the third part where I start talking about my identity, my political and social identity in part 3, I came upon the genesis of BJP in the year 1980. That's also the year of my birth. So it kind of fell into place because I am talking about events that helped me come of age. So it was, in my case, the demolition of the Babri Masjid. And later on, the Godhra carnage and the aftermath, the complete pogrom that the Muslim community faced there. So there were enough things to find parallels in. And I think, it was a decision, but there was a lot of serendipitous, discoveries on the way as well.
So I want to ask you, when you say that that was also some of this was your coming of age for you, tell us a little bit more about that, because a lot of people talk of coming of age. This was my political awakening. What did that mean to you?
Yes. So now, I was 12 when the Babri Masjid was demolished, and I was in Lucknow. And Lucknow has this beautiful history of not ever having a communal riot. But cities as far as Bombay were burning, and closer home, there was obviously Ayodhya, there were other cities, Aligarh, which is in a perpetual state of riot anyway. So there were more repercussions for these cities than there was for Lucknow. So it wasn't lost on me that I am sitting at the seat of this problem. And it also made me aware of what Lucknow boasts of, the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb. And I grew up, and because I was growing up in a multicultural household with my maternal family being Christians, my paternal family being Muslims, my father making a decision, a conscious decision to not settle in a ghettoized locality, sending us for mainstream education, emphasizing that you must look at mainstream education first and theology learning can follow. So when you're growing up in that setup, you want to understand what the big deal is about this religion and religious driven politics. And that for anybody in the 1990s was most important, and it was paramount. I mean, BJP's entire standing, or what do you say, political, it came out of that. So growing up as Muslim and growing up around the Babri Masjid time is definitely, it drives your politics. It shapes you in many ways, because you grow up answering a lot of questions, and a lot of questions that are based on stereotypes. And I wasn't particularly young at that time. I mean, I wasn't small. I was 13, 12, 13. And these are times when you are anyway growing up and you're trying to understand. So you go through phases. There was this instant, like wanting to disassociate myself from my Muslim identity, because I was tired of just answering basic, questions and stereotypes and clearing myths about your religion. So there are phases that did happen. And now, in the current political environment, I don't think religion remains personal for anyone. All religion is now political, whether it's your Hindu identity or your I don't believe in any religion identity, or I'm just a cultural Muslim or a culture, everything is political. And it comes from politics, right?
Can it be personal in this space that we're in?
In the India of today, I don't know if we have that space. We are always wearing so many different masks, right?
You use the word masks. Is that a deliberate use of the word mask? I mean, we're covering ourselves. Is that what you mean?
Yes, we are. No, we are doing this. As a Muslim, I can answer that question because yes, there's a lot of mask wearing that you have to do, and in the current political scenario, for sure.
I feel sad about that. Do you feel sad about that?
I feel sad for sure, but I mean, I feel sad. I feel cautious, but I'm not hopeless about it. I mean, I'm sure the wheels will turn.
Okay. So again, that may lead into what I'm going to ask you next, or maybe it's more or less my last question. Your book is, as a memoir, it talks about living through really interesting times. I mean, and it's undeniable. The last 70 years in India have been interesting. They've been perverse and frustrating also, but definitely interesting times. And do you think we live today in as interesting times as your great grandfather and your grandparents and all do? And actually, the question I'm asking is, would your great granddaughter be interested in? Would she think that your history was interesting enough to start a memoir with, maybe 70 years down the road?
I hope so.
So tell me more about that.
See, we've seen a lot of transitions in Indian society now. It didn't happen overnight. I mean, whether it's the politicization of religion, it was a steady route. We were walking on that. And so I can only see that intensifying it's already really at its peak, if you ask me. So and some of us are speaking about it. So I think there would be some fodder for my great granddaughter if my son even procreates. So yeah, I think that these are interesting times. I think this is like a cliff we've reached, and we have to see if we can, what do we do from there? But there is a lot happening in India in the cultural, and I mean, there is this the way Indian society is right now, it's like anything that's not the same color is viewed with suspicion. Like there's an insistence on being a homogeneous society and purity. So, and since I don't fit, and I'm also married to a Bengali Hindu, so I think there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to question, a lot that we are contributing to in trying to like see the India that my father was probably growing up in. And that's what I've also written about in the book, like that incident where when my house was being constructed in Lucknow and Ramayan and later Mahabharat used to play on TV, and all laborers would stop work and sit by our small television. My mom would serve them tea. Laborers from other houses would come and watch. So this is the kind of society that we were living in. And people could be bigoted, but it wasn't such a badge of honor to be one that time. So I'm just hoping that all of us who are resisting now are worthy of maybe being remembered.
Being remembered. Yeah.
And in that, I don't include myself directly, but there are many heroes wearing those capes right now.
Okay. Okay. So, okay, I have only one last thing. Did your father ever talk about BITS Pilani? I have to ask that. Being an alumnus of that college myself.
My dad did talk about BITS Pilani
Fondly?
and he encouraged his elder sons to aspire to get into it.
Okay.
But sadly, I took humanities, so
Okay.
I was the disappointment.
All right. Okay, so I want to ask if anybody in the audience has questions for our author here.
No, thanks. That was fascinating. How do you think your life has changed specifically over the last 10 years since 2014? What are the granular ways in which life has changed for your community and for you specifically?
So, Naresh, I don't identify myself as just Muslim. I identify myself as I speak for minorities. And my maternal sides are all Christians. We have nuns in the family. So, life has changed. Life is on the edge, and I will not try to sugarcoat it and say, I mean, every time a nun is assaulted, I feel scared for my Masis. And they travel, and they are mostly in tribal routes in India, and that's where most of these attacks happen. I get affected by small disturbances, not so small, lynches, everything that's becoming so common that now we scroll past these news that we've forgotten what it means, how damaging it is. So for me, I am affected by it. And I invest a lot of time in being vocal on these things. And I am often suggested by well wishers to tone down. But it affects. I mean, I live in a very I live in a good upscale Juhu Versova building where I am the only Muslim woman, and I'm married to Hindu, so I don't even know if I can qualify for representing a community here. And I can see the biases. One lives through them. It is, and I mean, I'm privileged, but a lot of people aren't, and it affects them, their psyche. And I am somehow I take this personally as well. For the Christian community, who is such a minority in the country, I feel even more desperate to speak up for, because the community does not really speak for itself. Their representative in the upper house is also gone, that seat reserved for them. So I think there's a lot of social work or social speaking that needs to be done on behalf of the Christian community. Sikhs and Muslims somehow still speak for themselves. There's a lot. They also speak for each other. So I think it's a tough time. I wouldn't look at it any other way. And like I said, I am cautious now. I am cautious of certain things. I'm not, yeah, it's like for everything you tread and you see, and you're like, how much should I speak? How much is okay?
Hi. Yeah. Hi. Thank you for your session and the interesting views that you have expressed. You worked in the film industry, right? Do you see this kind of communal divide increasingly playing out in the film industry as well? Because people think that the Bombay film industry is a kind of secular paradise, but now we have been told that it's not that anymore.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of propaganda cinema that has been coming out, and I don't think anyone from the film industry as such is very proud of that. There are pockets that these people are opportunists who are making these cinemas, as far as I know them. Some of them I know very well. I worked with them. But the film industry, a crew on a film set has such a good representation of Muslims, and so it is in many ways very, very cosmopolitan place to be in. I mean, of course, they are on not very, they're not HODs yet, but then it's also, they're poor. So there are carpenters on a film set, there are lightmen on a film set, and they're in large numbers. So it's very heartening to see that they're earning honorably, and there's always scope to grow. So the representation of Muslims on a film set is heartening to see. The propaganda cinema that we are churning off is not something that I think people want to look at and want to associate with. Some actors and some directors are doing that stuff, and they're making a lot of money. But I don't think, I think it's doing well. Yes, I've heard of certain people talking about memos being presented where they don't want to talk about Dalit people, they don't want to talk about Muslims, because the political environment is such that online platforms are wary of airing them. So if you, so that is driving a lot of these. But I don't think producers or directors on their own interest are not touching these topics. They're doing it because they want to lose money later or get into lawsuits and stuff. So to answer it in brief, I think it's still a nice place to be in.
Hi,
Anybody
hi,
else?
ma'am. So you've been working in the film industry for 20 years. So what was the biggest challenge that you faced as an author when you wrote this book? As an author, what was the biggest challenge as an author that you had to face when writing a book?
Because I am also a cinematographer. A challenge as such because I started my career as a journalist with the Pioneer, and I've studied journalism and mass communication. I've done a master's in this, so I'm kind of trained for both. And I continued to write. I was also writing. I was also managing a blog, and I firmly think that you can do two things without having to really cross over into one. I still continue to be a cinematographer. I didn't face any challenges in that, yeah, but there were challenges as in the realm of cinematography otherwise.
I hope there aren't any more questions.
Well, I hope there are, but all right. Well, thank you, Nusrat. I enjoyed your book, and I advise all of you to go out and preferably buy about 100 copies each, because Nusrat will be happy.
Very happy. Thank you so much to brave this humid weather and sit here and give us company. Thank you, Dilip. Oh, also, by the way, if you're interested in reading more on criminal tribes, Dilip himself has written a book on that, which is called Branded by Law. And so there's a lot of research and writing on that from him as well.